I followed my grandfather one night, and I wish I hadn't. He's lived with us for years, ever since my grandmother died. I was only 6 then, and for much of my childhood, he seemed like a kindly, gentle old man, soft-voiced, always ready with a corny joke or a new magic trick involving coins he'd snuck up his sleeves. I loved him. I admired him. He'd been a carpenter in his prime, traveling around the country and collecting old woodworking tools. He taught me how to sand down a rough edge until it was smooth enough not to cut your fingers. Now I wonder if there was a darker symbolism in that, smoothing out rough edges so no one would see the blood. It started about a month ago. I woke up past midnight because my bladder was screaming, so I snuck down the hallway in my pajamas. Halfway to the bathroom, I noticed a light creeping out from under grandfather's door. Curious, I tiptoed closer. I heard him talking. Quiet, hushed words that didn't sound like the normal tone of his bedtime phone calls. More like he was reciting something. My ears caught fragments. Tonight, bring the tarp and the orchard. That was strange. We didn't live anywhere near an orchard as far as I knew. And who was he talking to at this hour? My curiosity piqued. For days, I tried to figure out what orchard he meant. I prowled around the house, searched for clues in his old diaries or the dusty notebooks he kept on a high shelf in the living room. All I found were scribbled addresses, random quotes about the perfect place for disposal, and woodshop notes that didn't make sense. My gut told me something was off, but I was too scared to confront him. One night I heard his footsteps past midnight, crossing the living room. I crept to the window, peeking through the curtains, and saw him slip outside, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He never carried that bag except when he visited the local flea market for antiques. Why take it in the dead of night? Against all good sense, I decided to follow him. I threw on my jacket, carefully opened the front door so it wouldn't squeak, and tailed him from a distance down the sidewalk. We lived in a quiet residential area, few streetlights, all the houses dark. It must have been close to 2 a.m. Grandfather walked with a purposeful stride, occasionally glancing over his shoulder. I ducked behind hedges or parked cars, heart rattling in my chest. Part of me wanted to turn back, but I had to know where he was going with that bag. He led me down an alley, then out into the main road. Eventually, we reached the local bus station. I almost stopped, thinking maybe he was catching a late bus somewhere. But no. He cut around behind the station, hopped a chain-link fence, and slipped into the woods. I nearly lost him. My foot got caught on the fence, rattling it, and I froze in panic. He paused, head tilted, but after a moment he moved on. I exhaled and followed, limbs trembling. A short distance into the woods, I saw dim lights ahead. An old orchard long abandoned, its trees skeletal in the moonlight, rows and rows of twisted trunks. My grandfather trudged along a narrow path as if he'd done it 100 times, eventually stopping in a clearing overshadowed by branches. He set down the canvas bag. My stomach churned when he pulled out a shovel. Without hesitation, he started digging. The hush of the orchard pressed on me, the only sounds his labored breath and the crunch of the shovel blade hitting dirt. I crouched behind a trunk, peeking around. Sweat beaded on my forehead. What was he doing? Why was he digging at 2 a.m. in a forsaken orchard? As the hole got deeper, I saw him reach into the bag and withdraw something heavy wrapped in plastic. My pulse hammered. The shape was too big to be random garbage, too human-shaped. I pressed my hand over my mouth, biting back a scream. My grandfather was burying a body. He wrestled it into the hole, plastic crinkling as it slid in. My mind reeled. This kindly old man who baked me cookies and told me bedtime stories. Here he was, disposing of a corpse in the middle of nowhere. I wanted to believe I was hallucinating, but there it was, plain as day under the moonlight. He started refilling the hole, patting the dirt down meticulously. Then he unrolled a small tarp from his bag, wiped the shovel handle, and stuffed it all back into the canvas bag. I nearly lost control of my stomach. Everything in me screamed to run, but I stayed until he finished. As he turned to leave, I realized that if he caught me, I might be next. My mouth went dry, my hands shook so badly I almost lost my grip on the tree trunk. Thankfully, he walked right past, so fixated on leaving that he didn't notice me. Once he was far enough away, I crept to the burial spot. I touched the freshly turned soil. A final confirmation that yes, someone was under there. I had to bite down on my lip to stifle my rising sobs. I shadowed him at a safe distance all the way back. He returned home, quietly locked the door, and presumably went to bed. I, on the other hand, spent hours in my room, wide-eyed, trying to reconcile the man I loved with what I'd just witnessed. By morning, I was emotionally wrecked, but forced myself to act normal at breakfast. Grandfather looked tired, but he offered me a warm smile, asked if I slept well. My voice cracked as I lied. Yes, and he studied me a little too carefully, as if sensing something. From then on, I noticed all the innocent details. How he took frequent late-night walks, how once a month or so he'd come home with dirt smudges on his boots, how he meticulously cleaned a certain set of tools in the garage. Memories of random acquaintances or neighbors who'd moved away or just vanished from conversation haunted me. Could my grandfather have been murdering people for years, burying them in that orchard? My head spun. I tried to gather evidence. I rummaged in his closet, discovering more canvas bags. One contained rope, gloves, and a small saw. Another had a stack of old postcards referencing different orchard addresses or abandoned barns. My stomach clenched each time I pictured him meeting a victim, luring them out there. I half wished I'd never followed him that night. Ignorance would have been easier. But now I knew, and I was terrified. If I confronted him, would he kill me too? One afternoon, I mustered the courage to ask casually, "Grandpa, you ever do any orchard work around here?" He frowned, studying me with those seemingly gentle eyes. "Orchard work? Why on earth would I be doing that?" His voice was calm, but a warning glimmer flickered behind it. I laughed nervously, said I'd read about orchard reforestation, and quickly changed the topic. But the conversation told me he suspected something. His gaze never left my face. Late that night, I decided to check that orchard again, see if the dirt was still disturbed, maybe find clues. I left quietly around 1 a.m., but to my shock, the orchard was empty. Not a sign of fresh digging. I eventually found the exact spot and discovered it looked recently smoothed, as if he'd come back and disguised it further. The lumps of soil were rearranged, making it near impossible to see a burial. This man was covering his tracks meticulously. I recalled all the stories he told me about traveling in his youth, collecting souvenirs. A chill gripped me as I wondered if those souvenirs might be mementos from victims. The old trunk in the attic, filled with unusual keepsakes, began to feel menacing. Maybe each item corresponded to a life snuffed out. My mind spiraled with dread. Determined not to be an accomplice by silence, I tried to contact the local police anonymously. But what would I say? That I saw my grandfather bury a body? They'd ask whose body? Where exactly do I have proof? Without evidence or a name, I worried they might dismiss me. Meanwhile, Grandfather seemed to watch me more closely. He'd linger outside my bedroom door or make quiet remarks like, "It's best we keep our late-night habits to ourselves, child," with an unsettling grin. One Sunday, he offered to take me fishing, a common pastime for us. I worried he'd use that trip to deal with me, but I couldn't refuse without tipping him off that I knew. Out on the lake, we barely spoke. He cast his line, humming an old tune, but I felt his gaze flicking my way. I forced a smile, praying he wouldn't steer the boat toward some deserted cove. Eventually, we returned home, but the tension never left. That evening, he cornered me in the garage, away from my parents. He turned on a small radio, some oldies station, as though to mask our conversation. "You've been restless," he commented, rummaging in his old tool chest. "I see your light on at strange hours. Doing any midnight wanderings, My pulse thundered. I stammered a denial, claiming I had insomnia. He stared me down, then gently set a hand on my shoulder. "You shouldn't go out at night. It's dangerous. Sometimes people do things under cover of darkness they'd never do in daylight." Then he gave me a tight smile. In that moment, I realized he knew. He knew I'd seen him, and this was a warning. Paralyzed with fear, I shut myself in my room, unsure what to do. My mother insisted Grandfather was a kind soul, though I now realized she hardly suspected his secrets. My father was oblivious. I decided I had to gather real proof. If the orchard was a burial ground, there'd be more than one body. But going alone was risky. I thought of telling my father or mother. But what if they refused to believe me? My father might confront Grandfather, and Grandpa might do something drastic. I had no one else to trust. Finally, I couldn't stand the weight of it. I called an old friend from middle school, one who knew about my orchard story. He was skeptical but agreed to come with me, armed with phone cameras for evidence. We snuck out after midnight, hopped in his car, and drove to that orchard. The moon was bright. We scoured the ground with flashlights, searching for fresh digging. Then near the far edge, we stumbled on a half-buried piece of plastic, reeking of decay. My friend gagged, retching in the grass. We hurriedly snapped photos, but dared not unwrap it fully. That alone was enough to confirm a body. Panicking, we fled. At my friend's urging, we dialed the local sheriff's anonymous tip line. We left a message describing the orchard location. Then we parted ways, vowing not to speak of it, for fear Grandpa might suspect me. I spent that night trembling, waiting for sirens or commotion. None came. The next day, I saw no mention of orchard bodies on the news. Maybe the tip got buried in bureaucracy, or maybe Grandpa had ways to hush it up. He was a well-respected figure in our community, after all. Now, each time I pass him in the hall, he gives me that grandfatherly smile. But behind it, there's an edge I never noticed. I lock my bedroom door at night. The voice inside me begs me to flee. I suspect Grandpa senses I've told someone, so he watches me, waiting. I'm half convinced he might lure me out to that orchard next. My parents remain clueless. Meanwhile, I exist in constant dread, forced to pretend everything's normal at dinner, listening to him talk about the good old days while I wonder how many he's murdered. I wonder if he plans one final kill, me, to protect his secret. I wrote this account to ensure the story doesn't vanish if something happens to me. I hope the orchard tip eventually sparks an investigation. But if Grandpa disappears me first, I want a record. I followed my grandfather one night. I wish I hadn't. I think my grandfather might be a serial killer. The man who taught me to whittle wooden figurines is the same man burying corpses in the dark. If I vanish, look in the orchard. Look under the soil. My only regret is that I saw too much, too late, and I'm not sure if I can save myself or anyone else from his quiet, relentless evil.